Hello, everyone, once again. Today, we're going to have our second in our series of lectures remotely placed on YouTube. Today's topic is the three Edwards and the Celtic fringe, and this is basically the lecture that offers you background on Braveheart. We'll deal with Wales and Scotland today. As you already know, my love of political and military narrative is not the greatest in the world. Of all the things I do in my courses, this is the area where I generally feel least comfortable. So you're warned in advance about this, but I should note that this is absolutely necessary background for Braveheart. And there will be quite a few names and dates in this, and that's part of the reason why I don't like doing that sort of thing generally, because it's hard to do that kind of narrative with all those digressions about name and date. But what I do recommend that you do is go to Blackboard, download the outline. You definitely want to have the outline as you're following this, because that's all the names and dates are actually there. And we're going to deal obviously with some Welsh and Scottish language during this course as well, so it's good to have the orthography, the spelling for that stuff as well. So that's all on the outline. So I recommend, as I did with the other lecture, that you print out a copy of the outline, follow along, take a few notes as we go along. What else to say by means of an introduction? Life seems to be going on fairly much normally here in Richmond, and today you're getting to see actually my second wing chair, which I keep in the basement. Basically, the burgundy wing chair is where I usually dump my satchel when I come in at the end of the day. This is basically my TV watching wing chair. This is a wing chair that I inherited from my in-laws, essentially. It used to be out in their house in California and was moved here a couple of years ago after they left the big house and furniture was distributed. So anyway, I do think wing chairs are the best chairs in the world, but I digress absolutely at this point. Uh, Basically, in terms of geography for this, I don't think it's necessary that I provide you a map for this. You've seen lots of maps of the British Isles this semester so far. Obviously, we've been focusing mainly on England, but you know where Wales is. Think about that place to the west that's slightly more mountainous, more highland than central England. And then in terms of Scotland, obviously, it's the more mountainous region to the north. And so think west for Wales, north for Scotland, and you know just about everything you need to know as far as this goes. If you're curious about particular places that I talk about, just download a map offline. You'll be able to see all these cities and places there. Basically, when you think about Wales and Scotland, before we even get into the political and military details, Wales and Scotland were the poorest and least densely populated parts of Britain during the medieval period. They are both basically, to varying degrees, in the Highland zone. They're more mountainous than lowland England, and this is something with which every group who moved to England in recorded history dealt with from the Romans forward. Now, the Romans established more control over Wales than of Scotland, but their control in these areas, they were basically more or less military occupations rather than super great control, and it's not much different in the Middle Ages when you think about the English kings. In addition to the Highland areas, you also have these bogs in Scotland, which are a geographic feature that play a role in ability to control the area. And when you think about Wales and Scotland, up to this point in the course, and we're dealing with these areas at this point basically from the late 13th century into the 14th century, these areas had never been under direct control by the kings of England. But it's also during this period, during the 13th and 14th centuries, that you see kings across Europe generally trying to establish their suzerainty. In other words, they're trying to solidify their borders and to place the places that they have within their borders, that they place under their control, very much under their control, to be able to administer it effectively like they would any other part of their kingdom. And the King of England was no exception to this. He's part of this effort to forge national boundaries that occurs during this time. So it's not a phenomenon that's isolated to England. It's a more general European phenomenon. You see something similar going on in France as the French kings tried to reestablish their control over all of these powerful nobles in their own kingdom and to make the king's sovereignty more solid, if not absolute. And so, in terms of our story here, the English king who is most significant is Edward the First, a fellow that we've talked about in various other contexts so far this semester, the Longshanks. And you guys already, many of you who've already seen Braveheart, you have this visual image of him. He's the actor Patrick McGoohan, who played Secret Agent Man back in the 60s, or as he was known in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, Danger Man. They changed the title of the series for American consumption. So you already know him basically in terms of church and state, and in terms of law, now in Parliament and representative institutions. Now you're going to see him from yet another context, a more military context. So we'll just start out with Wales, since the Welsh story is a little bit simpler than the story with Scotland. When William the Conqueror came in after the Battle of Hastings and established his control of the island, in terms of Wales, he created these things called marcher lordships. He created this thing called the Welsh March. And what this is, it's sort of a buffer between Wales and England, because Wales was difficult to control. It wasn't under their direct control. These marcher lords, once they were established as this sort of buffer area, they moved their influence over time further west into Wales itself. The best known of them, the Earl of Hereford, the Earl of Gloucester. These were big marcher nobles. And so you have these marcher lords in this buffer state sort of there. The problems began to occur in the 1260s, 1270s, 1280s, in terms of a different sort of arrangement eventually emerging in Wales. And in terms of the Welsh players in this, the person that you need to know is Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, and I should apologize in advance for any mispronunciation or slaughtering of Welsh names that I do during the course of this, both personal names and place names. I assume a lot of you are already aware of this. Welsh is a surviving language. If you visit Wales, and I hope you do many times, it's wonderful, you will see a population that many of them remain largely bilingual. I would go into shops when I visit, and they will speak English to you, and as you listen to shopkeepers amongst themselves, many of them will be speaking Welsh to one another. And so it's a living language, and a Celtic language. And these are Celtic areas, obviously. Llewellyn benefited from disorder during the reign of Henry III. We've talked about that, the revolt led by Simon de Montfort, that sort of thing. And he carved out a sphere of influence. And eventually, basically, the English kings accede to this to a certain degree. It's formalized in this thing called the Treaty of Montgomery, which was signed in 1267. It recognizes this notion of a Principality of Wales, basically, that there's a sort of quasi-independent zone led by Llewellyn. And Edward III, not Edward III, but Henry III, and his son Edward, who would become Edward I, they acknowledged that Llewellyn was the overlord of most of the Welsh princes. You have these little semi-independent princes in the area. Llewellyn is their overlord in the same way that Henry III is the overlord of the nobles in England. It's a sort of a similar arrangement on a smaller scale. And Llewellyn began to refer to himself as the Prince of Wales, a title which will become significant in other contexts as we move along. He held a significant part of Western Wales from the King of England, but he was fairly virtually independent by this arrangement. And this arrangement could have endured had Llewellyn not been ambitious and very undiplomatic. He refused to do homage to Edward I for his principality. He refused to bend the knee, to use the Game of Thrones terms. And I should note parenthetically, I have completed Game of Thrones, and I thought the ending was way cool, so I disagree with a lot of people about that. I think they did it just about right, for whatever that's worth. And another slap in the face at Edward I, who had become king by this point, is that he married Eleanor de Montfort, the daughter of Simon de Montfort. And as you know, with Henry III and Edward I, this is a huge provocation. It's very deliberate, actually. These provocations eventually lead to something called the First Welsh War, which occurs in 1277. Three armies, English armies led by earls, marcher earls, drove into Wales to soften up the Welsh early in 1277. And then Edward I himself appears on the scene. He makes his main assault along the northern coast of Wales in the summer of 1277. He enlists laborers to build roads, so you have basically transportation for his armies, the infrastructure for it being established on land, and then you have a fleet tacking along the coast to provide support. Edward came in sufficient numbers, the armies were big enough, and the naval presence was big enough that Llewellyn was overawed by this, and he agreed to something called the Treaty of Conway in November of 1277. Conway is one of these towns along the northern coast of Wales. I actually spent close to a week there once with um, Professor Drell, back when we were much, much younger. It's a wonderful place, and I'm going to make a sort of a tourist board statement later on in the lecture about things that you should maybe do in Wales when you get a chance to actually go there. In this treaty, he agreed to the surrender of some territory, just as sort of a punitive measure. He performed homage to Edward I, so that was taken off the table as a grievance, and he retained his title. He was still allowed to call himself Prince of Wales. So, seems like a reasonable settlement. What's clear is that in the wake of this, Edward I is the direct lord of all the Welsh princes, not Llewellyn necessarily. And this treaty held, but it held for only 4 years. It leads to this thing called the Second Welsh War in 1282-1283. The Welsh became disgruntled by decisions rendered by English judges in land disputes in Wales. And land disputes always create problems. The actual event that caused the conflict to break out is that Edward I's justiciar for Wales, his top person, his top administrator in the area in northern Wales, was captured by Llewellyn's brother. And this sparked a full-scale rebellion. It led a lot of the Welsh to begin to make provocative acts such as this. And Edward I responded by taking a large army into northern Wales in the summer of 1282. Llewellyn died in battle against the Marcher Lords later that year in December of 1282, and the English speedily occupied northern Wales and began to reduce Welsh strongholds. The last stronghold, the last castle that the Welsh held, was taken in April of 1283, and this effectively ends the war. The document that concludes it is the Statute of Rhuddlan of 1284. And this basically creates a new Wales without an independent principality. Wales is now ruled by England. There's no ambiguity about it from this point forward. It was a conquered Wales. There were some revolts in Wales later in Edward's reign, but Wales effectively is conquered by this point. And this is perhaps Edward I's most solid achievement from a military and political perspective. Basically, in terms of the actual arrangement, northern and western Wales were held directly from the king and overseen by royal justiciars, people he sent there in his behalf. The rest of Wales was controlled by the Marcher Lords. The Welsh are not allowed to control themselves from this point forward. And you see a huge program at this point under him of constructions of castles, particularly along the northern coast, but also some in the south, some on the western coast. You have Flint Castle, Rhuddlan Castle, Blyth Castle, Aberystwyth, Conway, Harlech, Carnarvon, Beaumaris, and others. And these castles are amazing. The reason for this is that you've sort of reached the summit of medieval military architecture. They were never surpassed because they were built near the end of the age of siege warfare. And so these are as good as they got, and many of them are in a wonderful state of preservation. When my wife and I spent time in Conway, there is an amazing castle there. You get to, as a tourist, get to crawl all over the thing. And what makes it really neat, it's sort of at one edge of the town, and there's an entire surviving, more or less surviving, wall extending from either side from the castle that surrounds the medieval town of Conway, and you can walk most of the wall. And so if you want to see if you're really interested in medieval military architecture, go to Wales, and you can just go down the coast and visit castle after castle. Another of the ones I've been to is actually Carnarvon Castle. As you move west along the northern coast of Wales, it's more to the west. This is the one where the Prince of Wales is invested. Every time you have a Prince of Wales, there's a little sort of place in the middle of the castle that marks it, and it's another of these very spectacular castles. And so, as I make my plug on behalf of the Welsh Tourist Board, go at your first possible opportunity and spend some time in Wales. Now, Edward I, in fact, named his son Edward, the future Edward II, Prince of Wales. This is where this begins at this point, that the person who will become king becomes Prince of Wales. And this brings us to the issue of the current Prince of Wales. The Prince of Wales is Charles of England, the son of Queen Elizabeth II, the current sitting queen. And as you probably already know, I'm inclined to make snarky comments about the man, but this very morning he's been in the news again, and it's the unfortunate reality that apparently Charles has been tested positive for the coronavirus, and he and his wife Camilla Parker Bowles have gone into seclusion. And I will say, despite any sort of disagreements I have with the man in terms of some of his behavior, and some of his behavior has been very questionable over the years, I would wish this on no one, and I wish him a quick and speedy recovery. I'm sure he's going to get the best of medical care. Obviously, he's not a young man, he's 71, but hopefully he'll pull through this. So he's having a bit of an issue in terms of current news, and this is a way to cement in your minds what the Prince of Wales is. It's the Crown Prince. If it's a terrible thing to think of, but if the worst happens and he doesn't survive this, then Harry, not Harry, but William, his eldest son, would then presumably become Prince of Wales. He would be next in line for this. So anyway, that concludes our discussion of Wales. This is what happens there. Wales becomes much more integrated into the English thing because of the activity of Edward I. He successfully makes Wales, and it's culturally different, but it's part of England from this point forward. Then you have the case of Scotland, and Scotland is a different case entirely. It's Celtic, so it shares that with Wales, but in terms of its political and military fate, it's a different situation. Scotland was an independent kingdom, but it was heavily influenced by the Normans, and you have kings of Scotland. You have an influx of Norman aristocrats into Scotland during the 12th century. And if you look at southern Scotland, the southernmost reaches of Scotland, much of it is ruled by Norman aristocrats, many of whom had ties and lands south over the border in England. And so you have these guys who are aristocrats both in England and in Scotland. It's a reality there. Actually, I will suggest that in Braveheart, that reality is actually fairly well reflected. Mr. Gibson, in making the film, made it pretty clear that some of these people have interest on both sides, and that affected some of their behavior during what eventually transpires in Scotland. And the King of Scotland was the nominal subordinate of the King of England, but I emphasize the word nominal, that the King of Scotland recognizes the King of England as a superior, but it's a fairly nominal thing because it's very difficult for the English to control Scotland. It's relatively far away from the heartland of England from their perspective, and it's a fairly big place, actually. When you look at it on the map, it's not an inconsequential amount of territory. So what is the crux of the issue in Scotland? Well, what causes all the problems between the Scots and the English is an issue of succession. There's a Scottish king, a guy named Alexander III, and there's a very Monty Python-esque sort of moment with him. Apparently, he was out on horseback at night and wasn't paying too much attention to what he was doing and rode his horse off a cliff and got killed. Yeah, really smart there. Could this be the Darwin principle in effect, that really stupid people get eliminated from the gene pool? Well, we'll think about that one for a moment. You can mull that over yourselves. But where the problem, it wouldn't have been so much of an issue if there had been a really clear heir. Yeah, the king dies, you replace him with the obvious successor. In Alexander's case, it wasn't that clear. He only had a single heir. The heir was Margaret, the Maid of Norway. So it's a female heir to begin with, which it can always be problematic in succession. Beyond that, she was 3 years old, his granddaughter at that point. She was the daughter of the King of Norway because one of Alexander's daughters had married the King of Norway. And so you have this 3-year-old who's going to succeed to the throne in Scotland, which would create its own issues, obviously. And the question then is what to do about this. Well, Edward I and the Scots nobles get together, and they make an arrangement. They arrange to have her married to Edward's son, Edward, the future Edward II. And this arrangement is made in 1289, that this is how they're going to sort of resolve this issue. And the idea was that they would bring Margaret to Scotland and have her serve as sort of a royal figurehead. When they were old enough to actually solemnize the marriage, for them actually to be married, then that would lead to a combining of the two crowns. And so that was the solution that they were aspiring toward once Edward II, the future Edward II, would become king. There was a problem, however. In 1290, as Margaret was being brought to Scotland, she dies in a storm at sea. And this throws everything up in the air because there's no clear successor at this point. And the problem then is what to do. Anybody else who had something like a claim, it depended upon a relationship stretching very far back into time. There's no direct line claim. You have to go to basically satellite lines and begin to draw genealogies and decide amongst those people who might have the best claim if you're going to keep it sort of roughly within this family that has been ruling Scotland. This leads to the issue called the Great Cause. And all the Great Cause is this toing and froing that occurs over who will succeed ultimately to Margaret and become King of Scotland. The two strongest claims were held by some men whose names you'll need to know. The first of them was a man named John Balliol, who lived from around 1248 to 1314, and a guy named Robert Bruce. And there's going to be more than one Robert Bruce here. This is the first Robert Bruce that we're going to talk about, a man who lived up to about 1295. Robert Bruce was a great-great-grandson of David I, a king of Scotland. David I had ruled in the first half of the 12th century, which means to find a connection, you're having to jump back in time effectively for a century and a half to get somebody who has the proper connection as they're drawing the genealogies back. This underscores the tenuousness of even the best of the claims at this point, that you're going far back in time and going through these sort of lateral lines to try to determine who might become king. John Balliol was a generation even further removed from David I. And so you have these as your two best candidates. And there were a dozen other candidates out there. It wasn't just these two guys. There were other people who would have been willing to put their hat in the ring as well. They had more tenuous claims even than this. And so this was the complexity of the situation dynastically as they're trying to determine what's going to happen here. Edward I, since he's sort of the nominal overlord of Scotland, as basically the big brother to the Scots little brother, he was drawn into the dispute. And the Scots nobles turned to him as basically an arbitrator. And I assume you understand the concept of arbitration, where you select somebody who's supposedly independent. All the parties agree to accept this person's decision, whatever it is. The Scots nobles and Edward I meet at Norham in 1291. And Edward is accepted as the supreme lord to settle the dispute over the succession in Scotland. So he's the guy who's going to basically govern how the solution is arrived at. And he was also to serve as King of Scotland until a new king was selected. So he's going to administer the kingdom in lieu of a sitting king until they find a new king. As this process is going on, Edward I travels all throughout the Kingdom of Scotland. And he required anybody who had a claim to recognize his feudal superiority over Scotland. In other words, any future king, whomever they might select, would be compelled to recognize his authority. And so he's being very clear about this. He's going to arbitrate for them. He's going to help in the process of selection, but he expects this king to be subordinate to him in a feudal perspective. He then creates a court of arbitration, and a verdict is finally issued in November of 1292. John Balliol is to become king, not Robert Bruce. So he selects the person with one of the better claims, maybe not the best claim. It depends on how you draw the genealogies, but that's how they resolve this. But problems immediately ensue. Some of the Scots don't like John Balliol very much, and so that plays into it immediately. Some Scots would have loved it if Edward I had continued to basically rule, that they could have lived without this other guy completely. So you have a division of opinion there. Edward I, of course, being the person Edward I was, he was attempted to retain some of his control over Scotland, even after having named this new king. And he also accepted judicial appeals from Scotland. In other words, when there was some sort of legal dispute that couldn't be resolved locally, he would allow these appeals to leave Scotland and come down to him. And for many Scots, this is demeaning. It undercuts their own legal process, and so they had a problem with this as well. And his treatment of John Balliol wasn't the best in the world either. He treated him sort of on a par as his other nobles, as he treated him as maybe something less than an actual king. And this was kind of insulting to many of the Scots, particularly Balliol's supporters. And so you have all kinds of problems cropping up from the very beginning. What sets things in motion to become a full-scale rebellion by the Scots against the English has to do with this man named John Macduff of Fife. He enters in the story very briefly and then leaves it pretty quickly. He had a complaint legally against John Balliol, the Scottish king, and he availed himself of the opportunity to take it to Westminster to have Edward decide it. And Edward I summoned Balliol to appear at this judicial process, sort of as a way of asserting his overlordship over him. Balliol never appeared, and the Scots then ally with France in Edward's the first war against France in October of 1295, because Edward's fighting on several fronts during his reign. 1295 is actually a year of crisis for Edward. You've already sort of encountered that in terms of this document that he was, this confirmation of charters things that he had to do at about that time. This is open defiance of Edward I, and this is what begins to foment the rebellion. What does Edward do? Well, he responds with the campaign of 1296. Basically, Edward I was compelled to divert his attention from France and focus on Scotland for the whole of that year to deal with issues up there. He had an army at Newcastle in the north by March of 1296. He placed under siege Berwick. Then he allows the city to be sacked and all the male inhabitants slaughtered in March of 1296. And so he's sending a clear message here. He wants the Scots to submit. He's aided by a fleet moving along the coast, and so he took his army up the coast and fought the Scots at the Battle of Dunbar. In April of 1296, the Scots were defeated. Balliol abdicates, and John Balliol, as well as the Scottish royal regalia, as well as Scotland's governmental records, as well as the Stone of Scone, are carted to England. In other words, all these very basic Scottish things end up down the south in Westminster. The Stone of Scone is also known as the Coronation Stone or the Stone of Destiny. It was a stone on which Scottish kings received their coronation, and obviously in the more modern world, it is used by the monarchs of England at their coronation. The Stone of Scone was last used in 1953, and it's conceivable within the not too foreseeable future you'll be seeing it used again, assuming, of course, that the English retain control of Scotland, which is a separate issue. And as you know, Elizabeth II, or should know, Elizabeth II is quite elderly. She's well up in her 90s now. And although that family, they are a long-lived group of people, her mother made it up into triple digits, actually. The World War II queen, the Queen Mum, as she was known after the death of her husband. Very jovial woman, actually. They may be using it again sometime, and so when this comes up again, this is medieval history encroaching upon, of course, modern history through these medieval survivals of these medieval institutions. Edward I at this point believed that he had abolished Scotland as a separate kingdom, and he takes homage from all the Scots, the nobles at Berwick in 1296 in August of that year. The Earl of Surrey is named guardian of the kingdom in Edward I's absence because he retires back to England to deal with other issues. And for the first time, one man ruled all of Britain because he also rules Wales by this point. And so this is that one first point where that actually occurs, where you can say there is an entire king of the entire thing, effectively. This was not to last. Scotland, unlike Wales, was too big and too distant to be controlled this easily. And it gives Edward I problems for the remainder of his reign. Which leads us finally to the part that many of you are probably most interested in. Now we're going to talk about the Braveheart element of the story. The Scots Revolt, which begins in 1297 and lasts until around 1305. The revolt materialized out of the blue, led by this guy named William Wallace. And obviously, many of you already have the visual image because of the movie Braveheart. It is our friend Mel Gibson, as the image most people have. What can we say about William Wallace? Well, he was a gentleman, but he was not a magnate. He was not a major noble. He was the landless younger son of a minor nobleman in Scotland. He was nobody of any great political significance when he emerges on the scene. Basically, because of problems in England right at about this time, the Earl of Surrey, the person who was supposed to be administering Scotland, he and many of Edward I's supporters among the Scots, they weren't in Scotland due to these problems in England. They'd all headed south to help contend with this stuff. And this created a space. It's also at this point that you see the emergence of the second Robert Bruce, the more important one from our perspective. This is the Bruce that's portrayed in the film Braveheart. He's the grandson of the Bruce that we were talking about a little bit earlier, who had this claim. In the meantime, that Bruce had passed away as well, and also the younger Bruce's father will pass away within just a few years. He also appears in the film as somebody who's been affected by leprosy. So anyway, he initially supported Wallace, but defected when the English sent an army into Scotland. And so initially he is pro-William Wallace, then he backs off. But the English underestimated Wallace, and Wallace had a colleague who's just about as important in terms of the military element of this initially, this guy named Andrew Moray, who cooperated in setting off this military rebellion against English rule. Now, what to say here? Moray was the son of a Scots noble, and so he's a little bit more prominent than Wallace, but it's Wallace who's gotten most of the press. Wallace and Moray styled themselves as the leaders of the Army of Scotland, and so they have clear intentions here. The English army, led by the Earl of Surrey, eventually appears and fights Wallace and Moray at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297. And basically, the Scots improbably defeated the English there. And this is one of the battles actually depicted in Braveheart. This was the signal for a full-scale revolt by the Scots. Once they've had this military success, you see a big rebellion occur at that point. And what Wallace then did is he tried to take the war to the English a little bit. He took his troops, his men, and they head into northern England and harry it late in 1297. So he's being very aggressive. This is something that's also depicted in the film, where he goes down into England proper. And finally, Edward I emerges. He comes up to try to take care of this business. He leads an army into Scotland in 1298. And it's in that year that you have the second battle, the Battle of Falkirk, which is also depicted in Braveheart. The Scots were defeated at this battle. Bruce and William Wallace remain at large. They were not captured, but it was a clear victory for Edward I. Once Edward I left the kingdom, however, the coalition to him recoalesced, and Scotland once again became uncontrollable. And so this becomes a continuing problem for Edward I. There are major English invasions in 1300 and 1301 to try to create some stability and control. There was eventually, there were no military victories, but there was a falling out between Bruce and a man named John Comyn. Both of these men wanted to rule the roost, essentially at this point. Bruce made peace with Edward I in 1302. He saw this as his best path in the short term. Edward I assembled a great army in the following year in 1303 and enters Scotland. There was no organized resistance at this point. There were terms reached by Edward I and most of the Scots nobles early in 1304. John Comyn was the most notable of these nobles that made an arrangement. And so at this point, both Bruce and John Comyn, at least for the time being, have made sort of an arrangement with Edward I. It's at this juncture, right around this time in 1305, that William Wallace was captured by a betrayal. and he's taken down south, and you have what many people refer to as a judicial murder. It's that very nasty execution of William Wallace that you see near the end of Braveheart. So this leaves us finally, and this concludes at this point here, the actual not Welsh, but Scottish uprising, this war. This leaves us with the Bruce himself, who's made this arrangement. Basically, there's a quarrel between Comyn and Bruce, because Bruce finally decides he wants to plan a revolt, and Comyn doesn't want to go along with the plan. And so Bruce has Comyn murdered in 1306. And so you had this falling out. Comyn is removed from the scene, so Bruce becomes basically the main person in terms of resistance to England. He placed himself at the head of a movement for independence for Scotland. He's crowned King of Scotland in 1306 because he retained this claim, from his grandfather. The English sent an army up under the Earl of Pembroke, and Bruce is defeated at this, but he isn't captured. And so he kind of vanishes for a time in the winter of 1306-1307. Apparently he left Scotland. It's not entirely clear where precisely. There's a lot of speculation that maybe he went to Arran, maybe he went to Rutland Island, maybe he was up in the Hebrides, maybe he was in Kincaid, maybe he went to Kintyre, maybe he went to Orkney, the islands north of Scotland, maybe he was in Norway briefly. It's just unclear. Various arguments are made about where he was. But he returns in the spring of 1307 after having suffered this defeat. And he rallies, and he begins to reduce English garrisons in Scotland, sort of one by one. He doesn't want to fight an English army directly, but he's trying to reduce little English strongholds in a piecemeal basis. And Edward I is aware of this. He assembles an army again, and he's heading north to Scotland to try to deal with this problem and he's just getting ready to cross the border when Edward I dies in 1307. What this eventually organically leads to is to Scottish independence. Edward I is succeeded by Edward II, who's also depicted in Braveheart, and not in a very positive way, I should note. Basically, Bruce had quite a bit of ability. He's demonstrated that militarily and politically. He's kind of a survivor, and he knows how to engage in a type of guerrilla tactic against the English. And Edward II is kind of a weak king. He's not as good at this sort of thing. And so in the way this thing plays out, it's a battle between the Bruce's strength and ability and Edward II's absence thereof. There is a gradual growth of Bruce's military power. He gains more support, and he also gains more political support, more political strength. And he continues this piecemeal reduction of English strongholds in Scotland. He doesn't want to fight the English directly if he can avoid it, and so he just continues to take back territory by reducing individual strongholds. There was, however, a final effort by Edward II to reverse this. He sends an army up to Scotland in 1314, and in that year you have the famous Battle of Bannockburn, in which the English were decisively defeated. The Scots win, and this basically resolves the issue. And for the rest of Europe, it's a confirmation of a view that Scotland was a separate country from England, that you don't deal with England to deal with Scotland. You deal with Scotland independently from this point forward, that it is an independent state with an independent monarch. There's intermittent fighting for the next 9 or 10 years, but finally the issue is ultimately resolved with something called the Treaty of Northampton in 1328. And this treaty recognized Robert Bruce as an independent king of Scotland. So Scotland becomes independent in 1328. It's not something that continues permanently, obviously, because the current Queen of England controls Scotland. She is also the monarch there. It's called the United Kingdom for that reason. It's a separate kingdoms united under a single monarch. But that's a much later phenomenon. As that occurs, what is important here is that the Scots are independent. And when you look at Wales and Scotland, what you see is two very different outcomes. You see a Wales that becomes more integrated into England because of Edward I's activities. You see a Scotland that becomes independent. And if you've been following the news over the past few years, this notion of Scotland and its dependence or independence, its union with England, remains a current issue. The British had a prime minister, a man named David Cameron, who was a very problematic figure in a lot of respects, two respects in particular which impinge upon the story here in a more modern sense. In 1314, he agreed to grant Scotland a referendum about their own independence. And it was, the Scots ultimately voted to stay in the United Kingdom, but the margin was quite narrow. It wasn't. It was a close run thing. It was a fairly, aggressive campaign on both sides, and for a time there, in terms of polling, it was looking like it could go very much either way. And then Mr. Cameron did something else, and both of these have been considered in retrospect to be somewhat ill-advised moves, particularly the thing I'm about to talk about. He allowed the notion of Britain's exit from the European Union to be held up to referendum. And we know how that one went. In a fairly close vote, the British voted to leave the European Union. And that's an issue that has continued to be litigated over the last few years. Obviously, there is now a Brexit agreement, although I think Britain's exit is going to be complicated a little bit by our current crisis with the coronavirus. So there are other issues people are worrying about right now. And it's one of those things where you need more cooperation rather than less cooperation internationally. We'll see how that goes. But the larger point here is that the Scots are extremely disenchanted with this. Most people in Scotland want to remain part of the European Union. They feel like they very much benefit from this. And so the question that arises is, will there at some point be granted to Scotland another vote about its own destiny, another independence vote? Who knows? That's all speculative in the future, and everybody has other things to think about right now, obviously. But if you ask me, how I would handicap it, I would think now, if they were given another independence vote, it's a better than even shot that they would vote to leave the United Kingdom, and which would effectively practically end the United Kingdom. You still have a bit of Northern Ireland, obviously, and Wales is still there, and they may eventually decide to go their own ways as well. It's unclear. Obviously, the situation in Ireland is highly complex because of the division between Ireland and Northern Ireland, and the fact that Ireland is part of the European Union, and and Northern Ireland is right now, as long as Britain hasn't broken away. But does Northern Ireland have to break away as well from the EU? Well, that's part of one of the very complex issues that was making it such a difficult problem for the British to resolve this exiting from the European Union with the European Union itself. And so anyway, that's sort of out there, and it tells you sometimes these medieval issues still crop up centuries later, that a lot of the things that we deal with now are very much rooted back in things that went on centuries ago. And that being said, we've gotten through this fairly inefficiently. I hope I wasn't too incoherent because I have a tendency to talk a little too quickly, and I need to slow myself down. I'll try to do better on the later ones, but with these political and military ones, it becomes kind of a stream of consciousness thing with me. And I'm happy to say everything from this point forward, they're all topics in which I have some degree of personal investment, more so than I have in this. And I hope that will be reflected in how I present things. So bear with me. The one advantage of this is it's relatively brief. In terms of things going forward, since this is the entire topic, there won't be another lecture posted on our following Tuesday. This one's actually, it's Wednesday as we speak. This is going to go up tomorrow. I should remind you that there is, however, something that you need to provide me on Tuesday. That's when your prospectus is finally due. And I haven't really heard much of anybody from it, and that's fine too. But if you have any questions or you need some help, feel free to grab me over the weekend, send me an email. You can call if you want. You have my home phone number. I'm around the house. Obviously, we're not going much of anywhere. I got groceries on Monday, so we're sort of holed up here for at least the next, 5, 6, 7 days until we begin to run out of milk, and I'll have to go out and get some more milk or something like that. So feel free to contact me. We're here. And I hope that all of you are doing famously well, and that whatever your situation is, whether you're at home with your parents or someplace else, that everything is settled down for you, and that nobody's getting on anybody's nerves too much. I will be actually posting a little discussion of Braveheart once everybody's had a chance to do a discussion board thing on that. I'll let you know when I'm going to open a discussion board up on Braveheart. I do encourage you now, having heard this, if you made it all the way through the end of it, to go take a look at the film if you haven't seen it. Like I said, I should point out it is a violent film, and there are some sexual situations in it. And if that troubles you, then I can't absolutely require you to see it. But if those things don't trouble you, or if you've already seen it and want to brush up again, I certainly encourage you to do that. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say about it. I should also note that there will be a discussion board opening up on Jocelyn and Brakeland. I've already mentioned that, but I'll send emails out for all the stuff to remind you about it again. But again, stay well, stay healthy, follow all the guidelines, and so I'll check out for now, and I'll be posting some other stuff for you over the next few days. So take care. Bye.